Ladies and gentlemen, can I now introduce Antonio Martino to talk about the Euro aspects of the crisis. When this crisis first began, it was presented or seen by European policymakers as a crisis made in America. Within a relatively short time, it had become a European crisis too, and in some respects, the European crisis is proving to be more deeply rooted. Professor Martino is a distinguished monetary economist, a pupil of Milton Friedman's originally, president of the Montpellier Society, and ought to have therefore been the Treasury Minister in the two Italian governments in which he was a distinguished defense minister and foreign minister. But I regret to say that you have yet to become the Italian Treasurer, and I'm looking forward to it. Antonio.
Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for introducing me in your usual manner, which means I don't feel as if someone is reading my obituary when I'm introduced by you. I did not follow Norman Lamont's suggestion, which, if I remember right, said never engage in predictions, especially in prophecy, especially about the future. And the title of my paper is Europe's Imminent Catastrophe. My argument, and I'm glad to speak after you because you so eloquently proved about the house bubble, the point I'm trying to make as a general point. That is that economic and financial crises are always and everywhere the unintended consequences of mistakes in public policies. There is no such a thing as market failure. There are policies that prevent markets from working. And the result of those policies is what we call a crisis. Now, this has been true in 1929-33, the time of the Great Depression in the United States. Actually, should be the 1929-1941 Great Depression, because it was not FDR and it was not the New Deal that ended the Depression. 1 American out of 4 was unemployed until 1941. It was the war that ended the Depression, not the New Deal. It's true of the hyperinflation of Weimar in the early 20s in Germany. I understand Hungary in the Second World War had an even higher hyperinflation than that of Weimar. And finally, it is true of the latest crisis of 2007 in the USA and in Europe. I intend to argue that the ongoing financial and economic crisis in Europe is not different from previous episodes of politically produced economic calamities. In doing so, I shall mostly draw from experience of my country, but I'm convinced that the same argument holds true for almost all countries in the Eurozone. All countries in the Eurozone face a trilemma. They can have only two of the following three things: expensive welfare state, and therefore high levels of public spending, the euro and a balanced budget as soon as possible, and economic growth. You can have change welfare and lower public spending, and you can even have the euro and growth. You cannot have growth and high levels of public spending even if you don't have the euro. And I think it's eminently desirable that countries in the Eurozone are given the time to effect those reforms that would allow them to change their welfare system and therefore sustainably reduce the unbearable levels of public spending. I now come to the euro. I've been opposed to a single currency for Europe for a long time. My first paper was published after considerable delay because the publishers did not want to publish it. It was considered to be not European politically correct. It was published in June 1971. I was dealing with the so-called Werner Plan for monetary unification. The Werner Plan, which had been published in December 1970, called for a progressive reduction in fluctuation between exchange rates of European currencies, and finally, the irrevocable fixing of those rates. As a professional economist, I've continued arguing that while a common currency for Europe might be desirable, a single one was not. I remember favoring the hard EQ plan put forth by the UK, which recommended, at least for a few years, the introduction of a parallel currency. As long as I remained in the academic world, my arguments went almost unnoticed. But as soon as I entered politics, everybody seemed to know everything about them. I was called all kinds of names and subject to abuse. Eurosceptic was the most benign, but I was also labeled federalist, if not outright federast, at a Bruce Group meeting in London. I must say that today I am not satisfied with being considered Eurosceptic. I consider myself outright anti-European, precisely because I am convinced that a united Europe may be highly desirable. I am opposed to the EU and to all it stands for: expensive, arrogant, and damaging bureaucracy, needless attempts at making uniform and alike what is diverse and different, ridiculous regulations, and all kinds of infringements on personal and national liberties. Let me give you a few examples. Why should there be a European car license plate? In what way does a European car license plate make Europe more united? Are the 50 American states feeling divided and different because each state has its own license plate? Would the imminent introduction of a European driving license make Europe united? Then, what about the regulation the size and shape of bananas? Or the epidemics of earless cows? I don't know if you know that. You know, Europe decided that a country like Italy, which has to import milk, could not increase its production of milk, and therefore it had to be imposed milk quotas. It was very hard to keep Italian producers from not producing more milk. So bureaucrats thought in Brussels that the right way was to offer a large sum of money to all farmers that would kill milk cows. The evidence of the killing of the cow was the ears of the cow. Now, as everybody knows, the ears play no role in making milk, so there was a large number of earless cows going around northern Italy. And what about that directive on the European condom, which created some embarrassment for the Italian Minister of Health, because in adopting the directive, indicated a length that was greater than that of other European condoms, which raised the questions: on what factual or legal grounds did the Italian Minister of Health think that Italians needed more space? Now, the dream of Europe's founding fathers, incidentally I'm the son of one of them, preventing another war in Europe, has been successfully achieved. But nearly anything else done in the name of European unity has been shameful. The euro was introduced at a predetermined parity with pre-existing national currencies. The only concern the creators of this currency had was not to favor or damage any country from a commercial point of view. Now, the idea that a team of experts could decide a priori such an important issue is simply ludicrous. The notion that a group of experts could determine the purchasing power of this new fiduciary currency reminds me of the superstition denounced by Hayek, and I quote, "During the Middle Ages," says Hayek, The superstition arose that it was the act of government that conferred value upon the money. Although experience always proved otherwise, this doctrine of the valor impositus was largely taken over by legal doctrine and served to some extent as a justification of the constant, vain attempt of the prince to impose the same value on coins containing a smaller amount of precious metal. The new currency was supported by a set of rules aimed at guaranteeing its stability and sustainability, some sensible, some useless, some missing altogether. The sensible one was that the European Central Bank should have the overriding goal of keeping price stability. What was missing, however, is the procedure to follow in case this was not the case. The ECB apparently was accountable only to God for its behavior. In the field of fiscal rules, the creators of the euro sensibly stated that the ECB was not allowed to monetize the debt of Eurozone countries by purchasing their public bonds. That was a necessary condition for the autonomy of monetary policy and the pursuit of price stability on the part of the ECB. It was also, moreover, the recognition that while monetary stability after the euro's introduction was a European responsibility, fiscal and tax policies remained a national one. It is true that the Maastricht Treaty also had rules on the size of both the public debt and the annual deficit of member countries' budgets, but those limits were generally taken with more than the proverbial pinch of salt by all countries involved. Creative accounting and different and at times very ingenious gimmickry were used by almost every country, with the notable exception of Luxembourg, since the very beginning. It was only when the financial crisis in Greece and Ireland, and those threatening Portugal, Spain, and Italy, made the governments of France, and especially Germany, very nervous, that they engaged in aid to Greece and to a lesser extent to Ireland, and started to argue for stricter rules on the management of national budgets. Let's for a moment ignore the real motivations prompting these charitable offers of aid to Greece by countries whose banks had purchased large amounts of Greek debt. Let's also overlook the fact that in the middle of the Greek crisis, France and Germany forced it to purchase armaments from French and German producers, thereby increasing Greek defense spending by 20%. And this while Greece was cutting salary not only of public employees, but also private employees. Let's also ignore that Ireland was actually forced to accept the benevolent help, in the illusion that in return it would increase its tax rates. And let's ask ourselves if all this had any justification. Let me, to answer this question, look at the United States of America. The 50 American states all use the same currency, but each state is perfectly autonomous in state fiscal and tax matters. If a county, or a state cannot finance its expenditures by taxing or borrowing, it goes bankrupt. Nothing in the US Constitution implies that it is the federal government's responsibility to bail them out. Nor is the Fed coerced to purchase state debt when no private individual or institution is willing to do so. The state of Texas has no state income tax. It has a sound financial situation and a thriving economy. That of California, on the other hand, is overtaxed, overspent, overborrowed, and its economy is not doing well. I am convinced that interest rates on Texas state bonds are lower than those on Californian ones. Yet I'm not aware of any American concern about the spread between them. All we talk in Europe today is the size of the spread between the Italian long-term government bonds and the German Bund. Well, you know, the spread between the Californian bonds and the Texan bonds is probably higher, but no one gives a damn about it. Nor am I aware of citizens of Texas fretting at the idea that they'll have to bail California out. If it's sauce for the goose, it's sauce for the gander. If it's true for Texas and California, why shouldn't it not be true for Germany and, let's say, Portugal? None of the present concerns of Germans and others about the solvency of other members of the Eurozone has any justification whatsoever. Furthermore, the fiscal compact imposed by Germans on other countries using the euro is an unacceptable and unjustifiable violation of national sovereignty, a veritable coup d'etat, according to Giuseppe Guarino, a distinguished Italian law professor. I'll now turn to the unintended consequences. As we all know, Mark Twain was convinced that it is a difference of opinions that makes horses run. It's obvious. If everybody is convinced that the black horse is going to win, no one will bet against it. And there is no ground for the race. It is a difference of opinions that makes markets work. If everybody wants to sell, nobody can. A somewhat similar state of affairs is true for the consequences of economic policies. If in a given monetary area, some member countries pursue expansionary policies, while others recessionary ones, the consequences of the two tend to mitigate each other. If instead all countries pursue the same type of policy at the same time, the impact will be magnified. As a result of the fiscal compact, all countries in the Eurozone are attempting to balance their budgets as soon as possible. And in almost all cases, they are doing so by increasing taxation. They are forced to resort to taxes because their enormous public expenditures cannot be reduced in the short run, being made mostly of entitlements, namely welfare spending, that requires a long legislative process to be reduced. Now, a balanced budget may be a desirable state of affairs when public spending is not too high. In my country, the idea of balancing the budget was pursued with almost a religious fervor by the best political class Italy has ever had, the so-called historical right that ruled Italy from 1851 to 1876. The wars of independence had cost money. The unification of the country had cost money. And therefore the budget was in the red. There was a deficit. They wanted to reduce and eliminate that deficit, not because they thought that this was in the interest of their own party, but because they thought it was an overriding moral issue involving the interest of the country, the newly born country. So they maintained the tax on flour that was very unpopular. It hurt, of course, more the poor and the middle class than the rich, and it was largely unpopular. Finally, on March 16, 1876, the Prime Minister, Marco Minghetti, announced to Parliament that the budget had been balanced. 2 days later, the so-called parliamentary revolution made the government fall, and at the following elections, the historical right disappeared completely. There's something heroic about people pursuing the general interest at the expense of their own party, something that reminds me of Sir Robert Peel at the time of the Corn Laws. He knew that that would have hurt his social class, the landed gentry, but nevertheless he thought it was in the interest of England, and therefore he voted for the Corn Laws. Well, at that time, a balanced budget was a great idea because public spending was less than 10% of GDP. It still was a good idea in 1947. In 1947, Luigi Einaudi, one of the founding members of the Montparnasse Society, who the following year became the first President of the Republic of Italy, and Ezio Vanoni, a left-wing Catholic, both professors of public finance, recommended the introduction of a comma in one of the articles of the Constitution that mandated a tendency towards a balanced budget. They were different in all respects. One was a free market economist, the other one was a socialist economist. But they agreed that there was a need for order in the running of public finances. It was a good idea then, because public spending was less than 30% of GDP. But is it a good idea today, when public spending in Italy is way over 50% of GDP? When spending exceeds 1/2 of national income, it does not matter how it is financed, whether by taxes or borrowing. It crowds out private spending anyway. Private spending is crowded out by public spending. No country has ever grown when public spending exceeds 40% of GDP. Let me give you just one brief illustration. In 1970, there were two countries that had the same population, that had been spared the damages of the war, that were internationally known for the quality of their products. The only difference between these two countries was the generosity of nature. One, Sweden, was largely endowed with natural resources. The other one, Switzerland, had very few natural resources. Not only that, it was not even a nation. It had at least 4 languages, God knows how many religions. It was a mountainous, small country. Well, Switzerland was the second country in terms of real per capita income in the OECD listing, and Sweden was third. Today, Switzerland is still second. Sweden is 18th. Why? Because beginning in 1970, Sweden engaged in generous welfare spending, bringing the ratio of total spending to GDP over 60%. It stopped growing, and now, while Switzerland is still prospering, in Sweden, the national sport is how to avoid taxation. Now, the performance of the Italian economy confirms this pessimistic conclusion. Real income has been declining or stagnating for several years. Unemployment has been constantly increasing. It's expected to get to 13% next year. Companies are running out of business at an impressive pace. And youth unemployment is over 40%. Unemployment in the Eurozone in 2012 was 11.4%, with Spain and Greece heading the list at 25 and 24.3% respectively, with Belgium and Germany at the bottom, 4.4 and 5.5%. Despite some sanguine forecasts, which you have seen before in your tables, predicting that Italy should have a positive growth rate between 0 and 1% next year, most commentators are skeptical. No country can grow when the average taxpayer must fork out over half of his income to the government. And it's impossible that a country grows when corporations that already pay an enormous 62.2% in taxation contributions versus a European average of 45.5%, will be asked to pay even more because the budget must be balanced. I doubt very much that we are at the end of the recession. I believe that the worst is yet to come, and I wouldn't be surprised if a true depression would hit the Eurozone, the rapid increase in the money supply notwithstanding. Now let me talk about the future of the market economy. For believers in freedom, the last 30 years have been the most exciting in the entire history of mankind. Never before has the march of freedom seemed so irresistible. One dictatorship after another collapsed. The biggest and most brutal tyranny in the world, the evil empire, has disappeared. Inflation rates have been reduced everywhere. International trade is increased by leaps and bounds. Stock markets have boomed. Regulations and controls have been reduced substantially, and tax rates have gone down almost everywhere, and many countries have adopted a flat tax. Arthur Seldon's prediction in 1980 that the Soviet Union would not last to the end of the 20th century and that China would go capitalist, which at that time seemed like a far-fetched English witticism, has proved to be accurate. Here is a story that illustrates how much things have changed since the late 1970s. In November 1979, I started my course on monetary history at the University of Rome by exhibiting a $20 bill. And I told the students, this is conclusive evidence that your teacher is a criminal, because it was a criminal offense at that time in Italy to hold foreign exchange. The following year, in 1980, I took a sabbatical year that I wanted to spend and spent at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, where John O'Sullivan was editing Policy Review. Well, at that time, Italians could not have a credit card valid outside the country. So I arrived at the hotel with my wife and our two little daughters, and I asked the young lady at the desk to have a room. She says, "May I have your credit card?" And I said, "I have none." "Oh," she said, "I have to talk to the manager." She talks to the manager, comes back, and she says, "The manager says it's okay, you can stay, but you must pay for 1 week in advance." "What's the problem?" I took out $100 bills and paid. She saw the Italian passport, no credit card, $100 bills. We have never been treated so well as in that Washington hotel. Being born Sicilian at times is an advantage. The gradual liberalization of international capital movements that took place in the last 2 decades of the 20th century was in effect a mechanism for policy competition, forcing governments all over the world to pursue monetary stability, fiscal prudence, low taxation, deregulation, and respect for human rights and liberties. Capital movements have profoundly contributed to changing the world and making policies more compatible with human freedom and economic progress. The increase in liberty has made possible amazing progress in science and technology. Life expectancy has increased. New medical treatments have been discovered, and unimaginable progress in communication has taken place. In 1979, we did not have the mobile phone, the fax machine, or the personal computer. The 3 Ws did not mean anything. I very much doubt that there has been a comparable period of 30 years in the entire history of mankind with so much progress. In the late 1970s, the United Kingdom was the sick man of Europe, prompting Samuel Britton to write a paper for the Journal of Law and Economics titled "How British is the British Sickness?" Then came Margaret Thatcher. In the United States, in the end of the 1970s, Jimmy Carter had invented a strange index, the misery index, which was the addition of chairs and tables. It was the addition of the rate of inflation, the rate of unemployment. Well, it was over 20%. Then came Ronald Reagan. The Reagan Revolution inaugurated one of the longest expansions in the history of the United States, while the success of Thatcher's policies was so clear that no Labour government has tried to undo them since. We believers in freedom, have followed these developments with excitement and enthusiasm. Capitalism did indeed work. Economic liberty was a potent engine of economic, social, and scientific progress, an effective promoter of prosperity. Understandably, opponents of economic liberty, believers in big government, did not share our enthusiasm. For them, the developments of the last 30 years were not a source of joy. Increased freedom in international trade produced undeniable benefits for all countries involved, disproving the case for protection. Freer capital movements imposed discipline on all governments of the world, and a reduction of tax rates promoted growth. All the arguments of believers in the free market seem to be confirmed. This was a nightmare for our enemies. It is understandable that they are now enjoying the present crisis so much, arguing that it proves the enormous done to the world by unregulated capitalism, the nefarious influence of Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and the Chicago School of Economics, innumerable newspaper articles and other publications point out the crimes committed by greedy capitalists with the blessing of free market economists, philosophers, and other reactionary scholars. Keynes has to be reinvented. Mussolini's corporate state is enjoying a revival of popularity. And sooner or later, Karl Marx will be resurrected. Actually, this has happened already, both in the White House and in the New York mayorship. I suspect that the certainty of believers in the end of liberalism will meet the same fate as the Marxist prediction of the imminent collapse of capitalism, which has failed to materialize in more than 150 years. But while I'm optimistic about the future of the market, I'm also frightened by the probable long-term consequences of the policy actions being taken all over the world to fight the recession. Almost everywhere, these have comprised increases in government spending, nationalizations, and other less traditional forms of expansion in the size of government. Now I come to the future of Europe. What will the coming catastrophe mean for the future of Europe? Pope Benedict XV maintained that the divine origin of the Catholic Church was proven by the fact that the clergy had not succeeded in destroying it. The goodness of the European ideal has been supported by the resistance to its abuse on the part of Euro bureaucrats. Things, however, are rapidly changing. For example, in a recent survey, it comes out that 2 Italians out of 3 are against the EU. And Italy has always been the most pro-European country in Europe. It seems that the traditional brotherhood that unites European peoples is beginning to diminish, which reminds me of the case of that young American who had read everything there was to read about London, but he had never been to London. While navigating on the web, he finds an ad for a low-cost ticket to London, buys it, and goes to London. He arrives in London, the city of his dreams, a city he knew everything about, and he decides he wants to visit it all. And he starts walking. And every pub he sees, he goes in and drinks a beer, because he has read that Londoners go to pubs and drink beer. After 2 hours of walking and going to pubs and drinking beer, he arrives at a very elegant neighborhood where there are no pubs, but worse, there are no toilets. And after all the beer he's had, he's nearly exploding. He knows that he can't do it because the neighborhood is elegant, but he can't hold it. So he starts unzipping his pants when someone pats on his shoulder. He looks and says, "You're right, officer, you're right, but I can't hold it. I can't resist." "Follow me, sir," says the policeman. So they walk along a park, and they come to a big iron cast gate. The police opens the gate and says, "Go in, sir, and relieve yourself." The American gets in and he sees big trees, flowered beds, an enormous mansion, and he feels intimidated. But the policeman has said that he can do it. He feels born again. He comes out, he says, "Thank you, officer, thank you. You saved my life. Plus in such a beautiful setting. What do you call this? British hospitality?" "No, sir, French embassy." So, you see, I wouldn't be surprised if while the Catholic Church continues to survive the clergy, the ideal of a united Europe does not survive the attack on it by Euro bureaucrats. After all, Jesus Christ has promised immortality to the church, but no one has done the same to a united Europe. Thank you.